Does any other member have an amendment to call up? Senator Paul.
Mr. Chairman, our nation is weary of war. We've been at war for over a decade in two main countries, Afghanistan and Iraq. I don't think we're eager to get into another war. I talk to our young men and women who have volunteered to fight in war. I think it's not a good idea to get involved in Syria. I think it's a very murky war with so many different factions that it's hard to know who are our friends, who aren't our friends, who you should arm, who you shouldn't arm. I don't think anybody can sit here in Washington and say, well, I'm confident these weapons are only going to good, liberty-loving, Jeffersonian, type of Democrats in Syria, and that bad people aren't going to get these weapons. So I'm very concerned about giving weapons. I think also, when you think about the amendment that I'm offering, the First Amendment, it clarifies that the 2001 use of authorization of force does not authorize intervention in Syria. This is stating another way what we are already stating in the bill, that this is not a use of authorization of force. But it goes to the heart of the debate we're going to have, that Senator Corker has talked about having, about the definition of the original use of authorization of force in Afghanistan that's come to mean anything. And I think it's important that we state explicitly what we think it means. There is a great irony here in the sense that if you wanted to believe in an expansive definition of the 2001 use of authorization of force, it says go after Al-Qaeda and associated forces. Well, Al-Qaeda and associated forces are opposing Assad. So if you want to believe in an expansive definition of the 2001 AUMF, you might believe that you could actually support Assad with arms, that the original use of authorization of force actually would justify giving arms to Assad. And I'm not proposing that. But I am proposing that you will be giving arms to the side that is fighting against Assad that has elements of Al-Qaeda. There is a great irony there. I am also saying that in your rush to get involved in Syria, that you may well be arming Islamic rebels who will be shooting Christians. There's about somewhere between 1 million and 2 million Christians in Syria. They have been largely protected by Assad. I'm once again not saying Assad's a good guy, but I'm saying that they've been a protected minority by Assad for decades because he's a minority and it's been practical for him. They haven't taken a large position in the war. They're in the middle of this, but they tend to live in areas and have been protected by the Assad regime. When push comes to shove, I think there'll be a great irony and tragedy and sadness if you sent arms with U.S. taxpayer money to kill Christians. I think it could happen. I think it's impossible to know who our friends are. Look at how much trouble we have in Afghanistan. We have an ally that we've had for 10 years, and we don't know who to trust in the Afghan army. We've had probably nearly 100 deaths from Afghan soldiers. They lie. They come in and say they're our ally, and they take a pledge to support us, and we turn the other way and they shoot us. And Syria's a much messier situation, maybe 100 times messier than Afghanistan is. I know everybody here wants to do the right thing, but I think it's a rush to war. Now, people will say, oh, you're not putting troops on the ground. Well, we are going to have capacity building. There is no limitation in this bill on where those troops can do capacity building. I'm assuming it's going to be more in Jordan and other places. But there's no limitation here that the troops, U.S. troops, can't be on the ground in Syria. So this resolution could be arming rebels, who even the Joint Chief of Staff have said it's unclear, and it's increasingly unclear who our friends are, and it's increasingly difficult to determine who our friends are. He says in the last 6 months, it's become harder to determine who our friends are. This is the Joint Chief of Staff, who I would think would be privy to a lot of information and whose opinion and weight should be listened to carefully. So I'm very concerned about arming the rebels. I'm concerned about getting more involved. I'm concerned about the slippery slope into war. War doesn't always start with a huge battle or bombing run. Sometimes it starts with advisors. It did in Vietnam. Sometimes it starts with arming one group for the other. People may remember in Vietnam we had trouble because we didn't like some of the leaders. They were either corrupt or not good enough fighters, and so we got rid of Diem, or we let others get rid of Diem, or we watched over that. But we were always trying to look for better leaders, people who were stronger leaders. But the ones who emerge may well not be the ones we like. We think we can change the outcome. I'm not sure we can. But there will be a great tragedy if American arms fall into al-Nusra and to extremist elements in Syria, and I really regret that. I will vote against the entire bill, but I would like to present mine for a recorded vote, which basically says that the use of authorization of force from 2001 does not authorize intervention in Syria. You've already agreed to have this stated in a different way in the bill, that this bill doesn't do it, But now we're going to say, if you vote for this, that you believe that the use of authorization of force really had a little bit to do with Afghanistan, which I think it was primarily intended to, and that the language does not authorize war and intervention anywhere in the world anytime.
Mr. Chairman, if I could.
And I would say is that one thing about Assad is that Assad never really tolerated al-Qaeda. By defeating Assad, you will embolden al-Qaeda. Second point I would make is that the Christians, many of them came voluntarily into Syria. So Assad is not a great guy. I mean, Assad is a dictator and authoritarian like so many are in the Middle East and around the world. But I think it's important to remember, though, that Christians came voluntarily out of a country, Iraq, where we won the war and an Islamic government was instituted, and they felt safer under Assad. 250,000 Christians fled Iraq during and after the war to come to Syria. There are 2 million Christians, somewhere between 1 million and 2 million Christians in Syria, and they're there because that's the one area they have felt the safest. They're more there than even in Israel. So I think that we need to be careful about what we're doing here, because we are siding with the people, against Assad, who was one who limited al-Qaeda. He didn't tolerate al-Qaeda because it was a religious difference, and they were limited when he could and when he had the power to by al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda is emboldened. Iran is emboldened by the loss of the Sunni government in Iraq. And I'm not saying Hussein was a good guy either. But what we're setting up is maybe a situation where what I know you're all well-intentioned, but maybe what occurs out of this is less stability and more free reign for al-Qaeda, and that's my concern.
I appreciate the Senator's views. He has been consistent in his views on some of these issues. However, I strongly disagree with him. Are there any other amendments to be offered? Senator Paul.
I'll be very brief. This goes one step farther than Senator Udall's amendment, but I think it's an important vote to have, and there may come a time in a few years when people will look back and say, maybe we should or shouldn't have done this, and so this is an important moment. It's hard to look forward into the future. There were many people who voted for the Iraq War who then later regretted it. Will this be that type of vote? Probably not to that significance, but the future is unknown, and I think it's important that we all get on record on where we are on this. This would strike Title V and say no arms to be sent to Syria. I think there's an irony that you can't get beyond here, that you will be voting to authorize to send arms to an ally of al-Qaeda. These are forces that are allied fighting against the government of Syria, and I have no love lost for Assad. I think he's a horrible authoritarian like so many. But you will be funding today the allies of al-Qaeda. It's an irony you cannot overcome, and I would like to have a vote on striking Title V, because I think arming Syrian rebels allied with al-Qaeda is a huge mistake. Thank you.
This amendment obviously strikes the base of the bill, which authorizes lethal and increased non-lethal assistance to vetted elements of the Syrian opposition. I respectfully reject that any attempt to do so would be to arm al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda, unfortunately, is well armed with its affiliates like al-Nusra, joined by Hezbollah, and that is the present reality in Syria. And so I think this has been largely argued already, and unless any member wishes to speak towards it, Senator Rubio.
I'll be brief. I know it's been argued. I just categorically say that I don't think any member of this committee that I know would vote for anything that we thought was going to arm al-Qaeda. On the contrary, I think that if in fact this amendment were to pass, we would guarantee that the only elements in Syria that would be armed other than Assad is the al-Qaeda linked elements. And I think that while they do share a goal, the irony, they do share a goal of getting rid of Assad. The reason why they want to get rid of Assad, these different groups that are there fighting in Syria, is that they're the ones that want to be in charge. And just as they're fighting Assad, they're also increasingly fighting each other. And the problem is that if something like this were to pass, the only people who are going to have the best weapons in Syria will be the Assad people and the al-Qaeda people. And everybody else who's not al-Qaeda will basically be on the outside looking in a post-Assad environment. So, and I just would reiterate that the vetting process, one of the things the vetting process has to ensure is that weapons don't wind up in the hands of organizations within Syria that are either A, incapable of maintaining a chain of custody, or B, are going to, in fact, use it to do al-Qaeda type operations. And so I will not support this amendment.
Senator Paul.
One short point, and I think this is an important point also. When you read the use of authorization of force from 2001, it says we can go after the Taliban in Afghanistan, Al-Qaeda, and associated forces. It's hard to argue that the Syrian rebels that you will be arming are not associated forces of Al-Qaeda. Are they not fighting on the same side of a war? Can you argue there's no connection between them, that really this is a three-way war? I know that's the way we're trying to break it down. I don't think it's that easy to say that. I think it's impossible to say that the Syrian rebels are not associated with Al-Qaeda. So there is a great irony that you will be arming forces that a normal common sense use of the word associated can say that these people are associated with Al-Qaeda. That's all. Thank you.